Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation with the entertaining title of Emerging Memories Poised to Explode, which actually, we put in a subtitle here, The Long and Winding Road to Persistent Memories. It seems a lot of a long title, but that's what it is. This is the webcast you're at, and welcome. So today, I'm joined by two experts who I'll introduce very shortly. But before we start, just let me point out the interface in front of you. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the internet, would you believe? So I'm having to depend on my co-presenters for moving slides. But right now, I just want to talk about the interface. There's a couple of things you can do. First of all, you can increase the size of the window to a full screen. There's a button there that allows you to do that and explode up the entire presentation to full screen. You also have the opportunity to ask questions as we're going through. We want to take questions during the presentation because we're conscious of time, but if we do have any time at the end of the presentation, I propose that we do them then. But please feel free to ask questions, and we'll do our best at the end to answer them. And lastly, there's a button on the interface where you can rate this presentation. The rating scale is from 1 to 5 with a comment. 1 is, goodness, I wish I'd gone and played golf. And 5 is, more, I really like this, this is excellent. So, and also add comments, because we're always interested in your comments about the kind of presentations that we're putting together and delivering. And we want to get the best possible vendor-neutral education out to our wonderful audience. So, next slide, please. I'm presuming we're on the slide that's got my lovely features, and I'm joined today by, I'm a list driven, by the way, I'm the SNIA SSSI co-chair. I'll explain what the SSSI is in a second. And I'm joined today by Tom Coughlin of Coughlin Associates. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Alex. Glad to be one of the three graybeards.
Exactly. And Jim Handy of Objective Analysis. Hi, Jim.
Hi, it's always a pleasure.
So we're today's bearded presenters. Next slide, please. There's a SNIA legal notice here. This simply points out that the copyright of this presentation is owned by SNIA and also the two presenters who put material together for it, and that there are no warranties expressed or implied using your own risk. And we'd be grateful if you didn't go breaking our copyright. Please feel free to use this presentation, though, in informing yourselves as to what kind of technologies you're looking at, and et cetera, et cetera. But as I say, no warranties expressed or implied. Next slide, please. This is SNIA at a glance. We're 170 industry-leading organizations and individuals like Tom and Jim who actively contribute towards making this Storage Network Industry Association one of the premier places for getting education and information that's vendor neutral. We've got 50,000 IT end users and storage pros worldwide who follow us. You can follow us on Twitter, and you can also learn a lot more about our work, technical work in particular, at SNIA.org, which is the root of all goodness, and in this case, /technical for the technical pieces. Next slide, please. So I promised you earlier I was going to talk about the SNIA SSSI. It's got lots of S's in it. It's the Solid State Storage Initiative. And what we are doing is we're dedicated to fostering solid state storage in all its forms, whether that be flash memory, persistent memory, or any new and upcoming technologies that belong to you. And we're going to talk about some of those today. There are a number of technical work groups and special interest groups, some of which will get a mention as we go through this. And you can get more information again at SNIA.org, in this case, /forum/SSSI, and that will take you to the root of everything to do with the solid state storage initiative. Next slide, please. About our bearded presenters today, we've got two great presenters. Real industry experts here with a vast and wide knowledge of this particular set of technologies that we're going to be talking about in terms of persistent memory. We've got Tom Coughlin from Coughlin Associates, who does technical and market analysis, consulting, reports, conferences. There's not a lot he doesn't do when it comes to this kind of stuff. And Jim Handy of Objective Analysis, who is, as he puts it himself, a profound analyst, which is an entertaining way of putting it. And provides reports and services and custom consulting. So two great experts today who are going to be taking us through this new and interesting set of technologies that we've been developing over the last period. So next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over now to Jim Handy of Objective Analysis. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot, Alex. I'm going to be talking about persistent memory types in this. We'll be talking about market drivers, the support requirements for persistent memory or emerging memory technologies, and then share with you what our outlook is. So let's first talk about what the types are of persistent memories. And there are actually more than what I've got on here, but these are some of the leading types. There's phase change memory, which Intel and Micron are showing as 3D cross-point memory. We've got magnetic RAM, MRAM, resistive RAM or ReRAM, ferroelectric RAM, FRAM, and then there are numerous other ones with polymeric ferroelectrics and other emerging memories. What's interesting about the phase change memory, which is the first one that I'm going to talk about, is that it's been around for quite some time. This visual here is the cover of a magazine that used to cover everything in electronics, called Electronics Magazine. And although you can't really make it out on the screen, that circle in the upper right-hand corner shows that this is a 1970 issue of the magazine, where Gordon Moore, of all people, published an article with a fellow Ron Neal, who actually contributes posts to my Memory Guy blog. This article was on a phase change memory. I believe it was 256 bits that they produced in 1970. So, we've been working on phase change memory since then, and the industry seems like it's finally going to emerge into being something real there. The place where phase change memory is going to be used first in high volume is 3D cross-point memory. And this graph is to show one of the trickier things about 3D cross-point memory. The chart, which people who have seen my presentations have doubtlessly been exposed to before, this indicates on the bottom, or x-axis, the price per gigabyte of various parts of the memory storage hierarchy. And in the vertical axis, it shows what the speed is of each of these memories. It uses a log-log setup because if I were not to use something like that, then the orb in the upper right-hand corner would take up the entire graph, and you wouldn't even be able to make out the tiny little things in the rest of the chart. That is the fastest, most expensive memory. That's the cache that's closest to the processor. And so the L1, L2, and L3 orbs on the upper right-hand side all are processor caches. Below that, slower and cheaper, is DRAM. And if you, the blue circle in there is where 3D crosspoint is supposed to fit in. And then below that is SSD, which is slower and cheaper than DRAM or 3D crosspoint. And then below that, hard drive, which is slower and cheaper than SSD. And then finally, tape. What is important about this is that the only way something fits into the memory hierarchy is if it is slower and cheaper than the orb above it, although it can be faster and more expensive than the orb below it. And so that puts a constraint on 3D crosspoint memory that it actually has to sell for cheap, or instead people will just buy DRAM and use that in that same place. The crosspoint name actually comes from the fact that this memory is built a little bit differently than other memories, and it's a very simple way that it's built by having wires that run in one direction across the surface of the chip, and then the bit cells are a material that is above those wires, and then there are wires that run in 90-degree orientation from that, perpendicular to the bottom wires on the other side of the chip. This is the smallest way that you can lay out a planar memory chip, and it allows you to get a very small die area, but also it allows you to stack the bits so that you can realize further economies by getting 2 layers of bits on the same chip. So, this looks like something that should be the ideal memory. I've got a lengthy URL at the bottom of this slide pointing to a blog post that I wrote that gives further explanations of this. But a crosspoint is really a very ideal kind of layout for memory chips. The material inside that vertical part in the last slide is chalcogenide glass. That is something that Intel has been working with since that 1970 article that I talked about before. It's the basis for PCM. It's the basis for cross-point memory. And the way that it works is that a part of this glass is melted and then refrozen, and it's either frozen into a crystalline state, which gives it a low resistance, or it's refrozen into an amorphous state. That means that it's not crystalline, it's just a chaotic bunch of atoms, and that has a high resistance. And that allows it to be a memory, is that it can either be in a 1 or a 0 state at the time that it returns back to its cooler temperature. This is built on top of standard CMOS logic, which is very easy to build, and so it allows for this very small bit cell to be built. The moving it from an amorphous state to a crystalline state is done by these heating profiles that are shown in this chart. This is time versus temperature for either a reset pulse, where you're making, and this is the black pulse, which makes the material be amorphous or high resistance. And then with the set pulse, you put in a lower current for a longer time, and that gives it time to actually crystallize and go into a low resistance state. So it's very easy to set up that way, and it also requires currents in only one direction, which is, it sets phase change memory apart from other emerging memory technologies that require bidirectional currents, which are a little bit more complicated to manage. NOR-compatible phase change memory actually came out in 2006. It was shipped by both Samsung and Mnemonics, which had spun out of ST Microelectronics and Intel. It is now owned by Micron. Both companies have rendered it obsolete since that time, but it was something that there was a market experiment with this. It uses well-understood materials, and so that's why Intel has been attracted to it for 3D crosspoint. And as I said before, there's only one direction for current flow, which makes it very easy to set up the selector device, which is a very important part of any of these kinds of memory cells. I say that these are today's markets. These are the markets that have existed in the past for this, have been largely experimental uses of the technology and university projects. It never really got into very high volume in industrial applications. One of the problems with going off and building a new memory type is that there's a long, relatively unpredictable phase where you're going to be losing money making it. This is a chart that compares net profit margin of major memory manufacturers against Intel's non-volatile systems group, NSG. And you can see that Intel is the only one who's losing money from early 2016. Well, I should say a little bit later than that, because Micron did have some problems in 2016. But, that Intel did lose money all the way through 2017 before getting to the fourth quarter, and then finally squeaking by a little bit of a profit, and then it dropped back into losses again. Now, part of this will be due to the fact that Intel was investing in its Dalian wafer fabrication plant. But another important part of this is that Intel was ramping 3D crosspoint memory and selling it at a price lower than DRAM, as was explained in that earlier chart with the orbs on it, and this has caused Intel to have some losses. We're expecting to see Intel's losses come back during the DRAM price collapse that is just around the corner here. And so this is going to be a very difficult time for this entire situation. All of this is described in quite some detail in a report that my company, Objective Analysis, published on 3D crosspoint memory. It explains in detail why Intel needs 3D crosspoint memory and how it fits into the memory hierarchy, what the impacts will be of 3D crosspoint on the DRAM market, and when we expect it to sell in volume. Forecasts are made by application, the two applications being NVMe SSDs, and then the DIMM format, the Optane DC persistent memory, which Intel only recently started to ship for revenues. This report is available for online purchase at the URL shown below, or you can just go to the Objective Analysis website and click on our Reports tab, and you'll find it there. With that, I'm going to hand this presentation back to Alex McDonald. And Alex, I'm not sure if there's anything that you can do, but you were a little bit garbled during the first part of the presentation.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
If there's a place you can stand so that you'll get better cell phone reception or something, that would be great.
Yeah. Does this sound a bit better? I do apologize.
Yeah, it's a little bit better.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my internet. I think I needed an engineer of some description. Actually, I have the internet back now, so I'll be able to participate more fully in the presentation. I do have one question before we move on to Tom. I think I'll take the opportunity to remind people that they can ask questions. My question is a relatively straightforward one. NOR PCM didn't really take off. Why? I mean, is there some issue with the technology? Is there some issue with yields? What's the problem with NOR PCM that caused the major players to abandon it?
The NOR PCM really didn't compete against NOR Flash on price, and so price. People who have heard me talk before realize that I believe that nothing matters in the memory business as much as price does, and this was an important thing. But also sourcing, that the Samsung part was sole sourced, and it actually was only sold internally to Samsung. The Intel ST Microelectronics part was multiply sourced until the two companies spun out Mnemonics, and then it became a sole sourced part, and that also caused a lot of would-be users to be concerned about using that part, and where they'd be able to buy anything if they were unable to get it from Intel or from Mnemonics. So I think that was another important part, but mostly it was price.
Okay. Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the amazing Tom Coughlin, who's going to take us through the next part of the presentation.
So thank you very much, Alex. So let's look into, we talked about phase change. Let's look at some of these other memory technologies. MRAM is a technology that basically uses the spin resistance. It's related to the spin states in magnetic materials in order to create essentially another type of resistive memory. This is an image of a spin torque transfer MRAM device here. We have a free layer, a fixed layer, which is its magnetization is kept fixed. The free layer can switch, and then we have electrons with their spin states that can tunnel between those two layers, and the resistance because of the states of those two layers is what basically gives you the memory device. Going on in the history of MRAM, there actually have been a number of products that have been produced with what's called a toggle MRAM, which basically is sort of a direct offshoot of hard disk drive head design. They have a magnetic tunnel junction, which basically is an oxide layer between a fixed and a free layer. And the magnetism determines the tunnel barrier resistance. And basically you apply a field, and that causes the orientation of the free layer to change. And this had problems in terms of its scaling, particularly because these were in-plane devices. But with spin torque tunneling, the next technology I'll talk about, they've been able to get beyond some of those scaling issues, and part of it is going into a perpendicular orientation of the different layers, which you can see on this image here, where we show perpendicular magnetic tunnel junction devices here. We're showing, again, a free fixed layer or reference layer, and then a free layer, and a usually magnesium oxide tunneling barrier. And if both those layers are aligned, then that's a low resistance state. But if the magnetization of the two layers are opposite of each other, then it's a higher resistance state. Now, moving, especially in these perpendicular devices, gets around these scaling issues. There's a company called Everspin that has shipped a lot of the toggle devices that make standalone MRAM devices, but they're sampling in early stages of qualification and ramp on discrete memory devices. Now, in addition to this, they're also Everspin made a deal with Global Foundries, which makes wafers, to manufacture the wafers for their MRAM products. But also, as part of that deal, Global Foundries was able to get the technology with the idea of incorporating that into embedded devices, because that's what these foundries do. And in fact, that was the beginning of a trend in a way. MRAM originally was seen perhaps as eventually being a DRAM replacement because it's fairly fast. It basically has speeds like DRAM. There's discrete devices, as I said before, from Everspin. Everspin has actually shipped over 70 million units. They're in the process of converting some products from this toggle bit to spin tunnel torque. Again, they have this partnership with Global Foundries. But there's other people that are getting into, especially in this embedded market, that includes Avalanche as a company with IP as a spin transfer besides Everspin in the MRAM business. But Samsung, TDK, Toshiba, TSMC, and UMC are among some of the companies who, in their foundry business, are looking at making embedded device memories that would include MRAM as one of the possibilities. So there's some markets where these discrete devices are sold into. Examples include IBM this last summer announced a SSD that used an MRAM cache in it. So it's a very interesting market. It seems like it's about ready to explode potentially. And another type of memories, that's MRAM. Another type of memories is ferroelectric RAM. So ferroelectric RAM will cause lattice structures where I might applying fields can change electron state and allows me, for instance, to change the electrical characteristics of this material. They have a hysteretic loop similar to what magnetic materials do, only in this case it's an electric potential that's being created versus the magnetic orientation. So it basically ends up being another high resistance, low resistance recording state. So many of these things basically are resistive devices, although we'll get into what we called resistive RAM a little later on here. So this ferroelectric RAM, this is another technology that's been around as discrete devices for some time. Ramtron, for instance, now part of Cypress, with Fujitsu, is making high volume niche applications using lead zirconium titanate. There's other materials which are ferroelectric materials that are at least being talked about, if not actually used, include some thin film materials, and especially some organic materials being used in flexible circuit boards that would be able to provide a ferroelectric memory, a small size ferroelectric memory, and Symmetrix is another one of these companies. Now, hafnium oxide is a technology commonly used in CMOS manufacturing, and there is a particular crystalline structure of hafnium oxide which has been found to be highly ferroelectric and have very interesting characteristics from the point of view of a high-speed memory device, non-volatile memory device. There's actually a company in Dresden, in Germany, which is working on developing this, as well as many other companies using this hafnium oxide special crystalline form. There are current markets for these FRAM products that are being made, again, mostly standalone RFID of the low right current applications. There's possibility, though, especially with this hafnium oxide, that it could be used also in an embedded memory application that, again, like MRAM, would be very consistent with CMOS manufacturing. So let's get into what's often called resistive RAM. So as I mentioned before, a lot of these memories are actually devices that have two resistive states, and therefore, if you apply a voltage, the currents will differ. But there's a class of materials that are often just referred to as resistive memory. Again, phase change memory may consider part of that, MRAM may consider part of that, ferroelectric, but also things like memristor, ionic materials, filamentary materials that I have got a solid state material that can form ionic isolated regions, or that filaments can form, and these can change the resistance state of that solid state material. And also carbon nanotubes is another example of a memory device that would have changes in resistance in it. So again, there are many different processes by which you can make a resistive RAM. And again, that's any memory with a resistive bit. This just shows an image of a particular type and the general sort of if you will, representation of the technology, where I've got two electrodes and then I have a media that I am causing changes in resistance in between. And again, that changes could be due to, for instance, ionic concentrations and transfers as well as the formation of filaments, which could change resistance in that switching media. All of these technologies, these resistive RAM technologies, are small single-element cells, so they could scale potentially very well. And some of them don't need transistors to keep those tricky sneak currents from getting around to other bits and messing them up. So they can use diodes, which are smaller than transistors, take much less real estate, again giving perhaps eventually a real estate advantage on chips. And that's why there's a promise potential to scale beyond DRAM and NAND flash in terms of the size of the features that can be made. Presumably, these also can be built up into 3D structures. It's non-volatile memory. It allows you to write in place. You don't have to do a block erase, where there's this erase and then a write step with NAND flash. And there's fairly symmetrical on the read and write speeds, another advantage over NAND flash. And in fact, resistive memory is one of the things we've been talking about, is it being a potential replacement in the long run for NAND flash when that runs out of juice. But involves, again, new materials, new understandings, and familiarity, and integrating them into the manufacturing processes. So if you want to find out more about these persistent memories, Jim and I just happen to have a report that's right up the alley. It's actually the same title as this presentation, Emerging Memories Poised to Explode. We talk about technologies, companies, markets, support requirements. We're also forecasting embedded and standalone persistent memory. And we also, in the case of MRAM, are making capital equipment projections based upon our projections for capital equipment required to make these MRAM devices. And with that, I'm going to turn this back to Alex.
Thank you, Tom. I've actually switched telephones, so hopefully this is a bit clearer. I'm on a traditional landline now. We did get one question in from the audience, which I think may be more towards Jim's side of the presentation. So I'll hold off until we get towards the end with that particular question. But again, just a reminder that you can ask questions as we go through. Thank you for that introduction to some pretty fascinating technologies, some of which appear to be very much emerging, however. I think I'd be right in saying most of these technologies aren't commercially available. Is that right?
Well, actually, I would say that many of these technologies are commercially available, but they're not ramped up in, beyond niche applications at this point. There's some that aren't. I mean, carbon nanotubes are still it's not really selling products right now, but a lot of these technologies, or the overarching technology like phase change memories and MRAM, and also some ferroelectric products are actually available in the market. In the case of MRAM, there seems to be some ramp, especially with regard to embedded memories in SoC and other devices. In fact, another option on that appears to be resistive RAM as well.
Okay. Thank you. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to now pass it over back to Jim again to take us through the next part of the presentation, where we're going to talk a little about market drivers, support, and the outlook for this.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And yeah, you do sound a lot better on that new phone.
Thank you. Excellent.
So when we look at market drivers, the way to look at this is actually figuring out which different markets persistent memory or emerging memory technologies go into. That it does compete against different types of RAM and also non-volatile memories. It competes against conventional memory technologies in systems on chips, SoCs, which is kind of a fancy way to say microprocessors and ASICs. And then I want to talk about the economies of scale, because this is something that most people don't really pay an awful lot of attention to when they're comparing die sizes of these smaller emerging memory technologies against the more successful larger die sizes of DRAM and NAND flash. So this is actually a relatively old chart that I've been presenting for a number of years. It shows, in theory, why the people who have been sponsoring development efforts for emerging memories have gone and spent the money to do that. This is a semi-logarithmic chart. You can see that it's got processes on the bottom and then relative cost in orders of magnitude on the vertical axis. And then the two lines represent flash and then some new technology. When I put this chart together, and even today, I didn't make a commitment as to who would be the winner for the new technology. The idea, though, and the reason why all of these new technologies have been sponsored is because even though the black line is consistently higher than the red line, and so the new memory technology is consistently more costly than flash memory technology, everybody in the industry has been expecting for flash to hit a scaling wall at some point. When I put this chart together, I put it together with the assumption that it would be somewhere around 8 nanometers. It actually did happen at 15 nanometers, which is when NAND flash moved over to a 3D configuration, but the 3D configuration got in the way of this crossover actually happening. But DRAM is also expected to do something like this. What this is called is a scaling limit, that at some point the established memory technology can no longer take advantage of these new process shrinks and get smaller. And the result of that will be that this more expensive black line will continue to scale, and within a process generation or two, the cost of the new memory technology will fall below that of the established technology. So that's what everybody's been looking for. That's the reason why, since the 1960s, there's been ongoing investment in new memory technologies. So, to understand what this all comes from, you have to figure out, how is memory cost, how does it come to be what it is? And the cost per megabyte of memory depends on the cost of the wafer itself, and it depends on how many megabytes you can actually print onto that wafer, because making an IC is actually a printing process. And then the last thing is yield, which is something that is wrestled with constantly, but it is something that memory manufacturers are very good at getting into place. What's interesting is that middle bullet there, the megabytes per wafer, that's driven by the size of the bit. And we were showing you the cross-point memories before. Those have a very small bit size. But on that prior slide, the one that I just showed you, it showed the process geometries along the bottom of the chart. That is reflected by the bits actually getting smaller. And as they get smaller, then the costs reduce. And so the manufacturers drive their process shrinks to make that happen. And that's the basis for most of the shrinks that you see in Moore's Law. Now, what's interesting about these wafer cost and yield is that they are directly impacted by the volume of these parts that you produce. So I like to say that scale determines both the wafer cost and yield. The more you make, the higher your yield is, but also the more you make, the more you're able to drive down the cost of the ingredients that go into the wafer. But without scale, you can't have a price advantage. So since the beginning of 3D cross-point memory, I've been saying that Intel and Micron will have to have very high volumes in order to bring the cost down to where it makes sense in that orb chart that I showed you very early on in the presentation. So let's move on from that, and let's talk a little bit about what the support requirements are for these new memory technologies, because they can't just go off and create a market by themselves. They need to have support. And there are two kinds of support for this. One is hardware support, which is used for early development of systems and the development of software to go in there. And that also can be used for ongoing requirements. For example, you might need to change what the bus is that is used to communicate to the new memory. You also need software support, and this is a place where SNIA is very strong. You need to have support in the operating system if you're going to take advantage of more than just the cost advantage of the memory. All of these emerging memories are non-volatile, and so the operating system has to realize what parts of memory are non-volatile, or I should say persistent, and what parts are not persistent to be able to take advantage of the persistence of those. But then the operating system may know, but until the application program takes advantage of it, then it is not going to be able to do anything to take advantage of persistence either. And so this is a very important area that SNIA has been doing a great job in supporting it. But let's talk a little bit more about the hardware support. The hardware is where the system really gets all of its early development efforts. And today, a lot of the development for 3D cross-point memory is being done by using what's called an NVDIMM-N. This is a standard DRAM-based DIMM, the way that you add memory into all computers, with an added twist. It has flash memory on it that is capable of grabbing all of the data that's inside the DRAM and storing it in the case of a power failure. That doesn't automatically happen, though. It has to have some smarts in there. And so the DIMM has a controller that does the job of moving the data from the DRAM into the NAND flash. And then when the power is restored, it moves the data automatically back from the NAND flash into the DRAM so that the system can be up and running again. But then a third component of this is that it needs to have a power source, because when the power is lost in the rest of the system, then this power source has to keep the DRAM alive and provide the programming power to the NAND flash while the controller is moving that data around. So this is a very important component, much more complex than what future emerging memory DIMMs will be like, but it supports the development of software for this. Now, the system also needs to understand that when it wakes up from a cold boot, that there might be something in that NVDIMM-N or in the persistent memory in the future that is worth looking at. It won't be just scrambled data like it is in today's systems. And so that requires changes in the BIOS, the basic I/O subsystem, which is in the flash memory that's on every motherboard of every computer. And those have been worked out. And then there's one other thing, and that is that somehow or another the DIMM has to learn that there's been a power failure so that it can make sure that the data gets moved from the DRAM into the NAND flash. And so a new signal needs to come to it. This signal today is brought in by a separate wire onto the DIMM to indicate the power failure. However, in the future, that signal will be a part of the DRAM bus. There's a report that Objective Analysis wrote on the NVDIMM market, including NVDIMM-N, which I just described, but also future NVDIMM-Ps, which will include anything that has an emerging memory technology on it. It gives vendor profiles for the vendors who are doing those and talks about what the support requirements are for NVDIMM-N. And then it also forecasts what the market is likely to look for these. So if you go to the URL at the bottom of this slide, which should be available on the PDF version of the slides that can be downloaded later on, then this is something that you can download, purchase for immediate download on the Objective Analysis website. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Alex.
Thank you. Just a quick question, actually. We've had three questions in. There's one I think that either or both of you could address. So just let me ask this one. What are the endurance limitations of PCM and spin transfer in comparison with DRAM's infinite endurance? I mean, are there endurance limits to these phase change technologies or spin transfer technologies?
Well, first of all, I have to say that it figures that a Scot would say DRAM instead of DRAM.
Okay, DRAM.
but
Mine's on you.
Yeah, what's interesting is that phase change memories endurance, especially in the 3D cross-point memory, has not been specifically announced by Intel or Micron. They, I'm sure, are sharing that with people who are using their technology under a non-disclosure agreement, but it's not information that I'm knowledgeable about. I know that it's supposed to be 1,000 times the endurance of NAND flash was what the companies were saying in 2015.
10 to the 6th is kind of an estimate. Yeah.
Yeah, and on the Memory Guy blog, if you look for endurance and crosspoint in the search bar, then that'll take you to a couple of blog posts that I've written analyzing Intel's NVMe SSDs and estimating what the endurance would be for the material inside. But that's just a guess. DRAM has infinite endurance. I think Tom would probably be better than me at talking about what MRAM's endurance is. But
so MRAM's endurance is MRAM's endurance is very high. In fact, there's numbers that are somewhere 10 to the 11 or even higher. Now, one thing should be kept in mind is a lot of times, depending upon the application, endurance may or may not be the primary factor, and there are trade-offs often between capacity, data retention in memory cells, and endurance. So, the actual numbers, the actual endurance for MRAM tends to be pretty high, but the actual value will depend upon, the trade-offs that are made in its design, just like a lot of these other memory technologies.
Yeah, good points. I'd also point out
something else, just briefly to keep in mind too, is that as software starts taking advantage of these memories, I expect for it to be written with the sophistication required that it will separate the high write load things and put those into DRAM and leave in persistent memory the things that don't require frequent overwrites.
Yeah, that was going to be my point. We're going to see an awful lot of caching going on anyway. It's something that people will probably write specifically for, rather than just treating as a general memory resource. Okay, so forward and onward. Tom, can I ask you to take us through some of the ongoing... Oops, sorry, I moved forward, so did you. There we go, the ongoing hardware requirements. What are you?
Okay, so I'm in the final stretch, and then we can get to the rest of the questions there. Jim started out on the memory requirements. Now, in addition, there may be architecture requirements in the devices, the non-uniform memory architecture, memory management units that redesign, context switches, and the DDR bus for non-deterministic access times. Most of these technologies are fast, but they may not be as fast as the fastest memory, and so there's some tricks in terms of how to make the best use of them. And actually, SNIA has been doing a lot of work in this area in the solid-state storage initiative, particularly on this. And I think Jim referred to this earlier. There's a persistent memory programming model that they developed, and here's a chart that's been shown many times. But basically, it's talking about development of persistent memory access, and actually a lot of some elements of this have gone into the development of NVMe, for example, where I can do traditional, for instance, file-aware systems, where I'm going through the traditional drivers to the devices. But also, if you look on the far right there, where I can have direct access from the application to the memory device there with some kind of a memory module mapping there. And that's kind of a holy grail in a way, because that would give you the fastest type performance and a real memory type of architecture. And so, go on to the next slide. There's the developments, as Jim indicated also, that are going on with regard to developing programs that know about the capabilities of persistent memory and take advantage of it. Maybe take advantage also of tiering of memory layers that might occur, for instance, DRAM and MRAM, for example, or phase change memory. Right now, a lot of our software is not built around that. It will take some time for all the operating systems, all the drivers, etc., to be built around this concept of persistent memory. But those changes are being made, and the industry will benefit from that. So let's take a quick look at the future outlooks. So persistent memory is part of a greater memory ecosystem. It's in the near term, at least, it's not clear that any of these new memories are directly replacing and obsoleting a current memory. And they're more like for augmentation and getting better performance, or even new applications like Internet of Things. The memory market also, as we'll get into here in a little bit, the economics is very swings wildly depending upon supply and demand. And these implementation of these emerging memories into foundries will have a huge impact on the growth and manufacturing volume of these products, and therefore the cost. So now, emerging memories, new memories will also have to compete against developments that are going on in conventional memories, be it 3D NAND or DRAM. Here's a projection showing 3D NAND layers increasing. In fact, people have talked about going above 500 layers. So sometime in the next decade, we'd be seeing over 500 layer NAND devices. These would, the way this is being done is generally by creating strings of smaller number of stacks that you put on top of each other. Makes it a little easier to manage and to manufacture these devices, but that's being used in the next generation 96-layer products by all the companies, and it's liable to continue going into 500 or more layers into the future. Talked before about the swings in the market. So we just got out of a period where there was a shortage of NAND flash, and part of that was the transition from planar to 3D flash, and the time it took to get those new the new technology into manufacturing with good yields and high volumes. Now we're in market phase where there is some oversupply of NAND flash, and so that's bringing down the prices. When there's an oversupply, then the prices drop. The manufacturers don't invest as much into the new plants. Okay, eventually, with demand continuing to increase for these storage devices and memory, then you start to demand comes to match the new supply, and then you start to get shortages again. That leads manufacturers then to invest in new plants. So it's kind of a boom-bust cycle that results from this in terms of NAND flash pricing, or any other memory technology too, because of the cost of making these products. So the current cycle, there are some price drops in 2018. It's the largest ever price to cost gap, and this is driven by the overcapacity versus the demand at the moment. It's probably going to continue into early 2019, maybe even go down to cost for manufacturing then, and we'll probably could hug that cost curve until the next shortage occurs, in which case the price will go up again. And China's market entry may extend the oversupply, particularly for lower capacity products, and but it may extend the oversupply in some areas at least. So what's the impact of the current economics condition on persistent memories? Well, with persistent memories, you're going to have to compete against existing technologies. Remember that chart we have it over here on the right-hand side that Jim showed earlier. DRAM, or the phase change, 3D cross-point memory is supposed to go between DRAM and hard disk drives. If the price of DRAM goes down, for example, then the price of 3D cross-point must go down in order to continue demand for 3D cross-point. Otherwise, they'll buy DRAM, unless they really need the non-volatility, because they can get a faster performance. So a DRAM collapse will create an X-point collapse in terms of prices, even though it's only a sole source. It's not a supply situation. It's more like it's competing against other technologies. So here's kind of an outline from our report on it, the report on persistent memories, or emerging memories poised to explode, showing a timeline for changes. That logic, with the loss of the scaling capabilities that were brought about by Moore's law, we're going to see changes in logic processes and the ways it's done, whether it's quantum computing, adiabatic computing, or various other things. There's a possibility that someday, if NAND flash runs out of layers, that resistive RAM could take over for NAND flash and even scale to be smaller devices. DRAM perhaps could sometime in the next decade, we might MRAM may go below their cost and actually start to replace DRAM. So these are projections we've got working into our market, and based upon this, here's an estimate for high, low, and baseline petabyte emerging memory shipments. And so you can see that we're projecting by 2028 that there's a potential for a fairly large amount of shipping emerging memory capacity, and that market could exceed $6 billion by 2023. Now, this is all in this emerging memories poised to explode, and you can click that link, and you can do an online purchase of that report. And Jim and I would really appreciate it if you would do that. So with that, here's some resources on all of blogs and reports. And I should have put I do a Forbes blog, Storage Bytes. I do regular stuff on that too. I should put that in there as well.
Yeah, we forgot that one.
About various storage and memory topics. And with that, Alex, it's back to you, and then finish up with questions.
Thank you. We did promise the audience that we would take some questions at the end if we had the time, and we do. We've got about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to take some of these questions in no particular order. Will Micron commercialize 3D XPoint? The observation is that we don't see them in the market as much as Intel on Optane.
Yeah, if I may, this is something that I get asked an awful lot. And the way that I look at this is that 3D XPoint, first of all, its major market will be in DIMMs, which is something that is required for certain Intel processors to really show how well they can perform. And so Intel is highly motivated to do this. They are losing money on it, and the way that I put it is, let's say they lose $10 for every system that they ship their 3D XPoint memory into, but they make an extra $50 by selling a more expensive processor, then they've made good money on this deal, and it makes sense. Unfortunately, Intel is the only company that has the processor sales that can take advantage of this. And so Micron seems to be very aware of how much 3D XPoint costs to make and how much it sells for, and I think that they're waiting until the costs fall below what the market price is before they enter the market, because they can't offset their losses in 3D XPoint with increased processor sales. They have to make the 3D XPoint profitable. So I'm not expecting to see Micron do that until there's a path to profitability for this product.
Okay, it's money again. All boils down to money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Amazing how that works.
The other one was thoughts on NRAM, nanotube RAM.
That's something that is, very much Nantero's business. I'm not aware of any other companies that are making that. And so far, I'm not aware of anything that has shipped using NRAM, although it's a very encouraging sign that Fujitsu, who has shipped more ferroelectric chips than any other company, and may even have shipped more emerging memory chips than any other company, that they have become a licensee of Nantero. I think that's a very positive sign, and I'm just waiting to see some chips come out. I don't know, Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, especially if the Nantero guys are listening, is that probably the best path to this is what, say, the ferroelectric and even the MRAM guys have done. They've looked at niche markets where their particular memory could have advantages and be, maybe not a lot of memory, but it provides an advantage to the people that use it. By getting those niche markets, starting to build them up, you build up your experience, develop an understanding of the yield issues and how to improve them. And you also, the consequence of that, build up the capability of understanding the actual cost to manufacture and the potential for a higher volume for further applications. In principle, nanotube RAM could be a very effective memory for many applications. It just has to prove itself and meet those economic as well as technical requirements.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. One for both of you again. NVDIMM, will it continue to coexist with newer classes of memory like NVDIMM-P, or is NVDIMM simply a stepping stone towards something else and it'll die and wither away over a period of time?
That's a little bit hard to tell.
Yeah.
But, it is a good question. The reason why is because NVDIMM-N performs as well as DRAM. And there's no expectation for NVDIMM-Ps to offer DRAM performance. It will be near DRAM performance, but today the expectation is that it will have a lower performance. I say that, yet Everspin does have I think it's a DDR3 DIMM that they're shipping, which does offer DRAM level performance. So, it could be that will continue on.
one or two more questions. Any comments on HPE's memristor?
The memristor. Yes, we have fond memories of the memristor. It's a resistive memory technology. It again was introduced by HPE. You don't hear much about it anymore. So I think it's kind of, my impression is that it's pretty well de-emphasized at this point versus other approaches for this resistive RAM. Jim, do you have any difference in that opinion?
No, I don't. And this is one of those places where it's going to be hit by the economies of scale again. If HP is the only company that's using it, then it's never going to be able to get its costs down to the point where it would make sense. However, I think, too, the timing of the de-emphasis kind of aligned with the timing of Intel and Micron's announcement of 3D crosspoint memory. So although I haven't been able to get anybody to confirm it, I suspect that HP is now looking very hard at 3D crosspoint as an alternative to the memristor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. I'm going to bring this to a close now. We're coming up towards the top of the hour. I just want to thank Jim Handy and Tom Coughlin for this excellent and very informative presentation. I learn something new every time I listen to them. Just to tell you that we're going to be doing a Q&A from this webcast. So the questions that you've asked today, we'll do a Q&A on the blog. We'll have that up in probably a week or so's time. You'll see that on SNIA, SSSIblog.org. Lovely name, but that's what we have. You'll also find this webcast and a PDF of the slides on the SSSI website. As you leave, please, please, please do rate the presentation. Do give us that 5-star rating, and also leave any comments that you may have about the quality of what you've heard today, more information that you would like, whatever you would like to put in there. We'd be grateful for the feedback. So, Jim, Tom, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the audience for putting up with my terrible telephony and really bad internet connection, for which I sincerely apologize. Anyway, have a very good day, guys, and it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for being our moderator, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye.